The individual recognized by historical accounts as King Athelstan of England was most likely born sometime in the year 893 or 894. We possess no record of his birth, but one of the most important narratives concerning his life does note that Athelstan had attained approximately 30 years of age when he ascended as King of Wessex. This event occurred in the summer of 924, leading to the conclusion that Athelstan must have been born around 893, 894, or possibly 897. His name derives from the Germanic terms edel, signifying noble, and stan, meaning stone. Thus, Athelstan effectively meant noble stone. His father was Edward, a son of King Alfred of Wessex, a kingdom that dominated southern England in the 9th century and served as the bulwark of the Anglo-Saxons against the Danes, who had conquered a vast portion of Britain in the latter half of the 9th century. Alfred stands as the first Anglo-Saxon ruler credited with organizing a robust defense of his realms against the Norse invaders, and is known as Alfred the Great in recognition of this accomplishment and his strengthening of the Kingdom of Wessex. He would pass away in 899 when Athelstan was merely a child, whereupon Athelstan's father assumed the title of King of Wessex. He is referred to in historical writings as Edward the Elder. The identity of Athelstan's mother remains somewhat uncertain. Edward the Elder had several consorts, and his marital status was at times ambiguous. Some historians have asserted that Athelstan's mother was the first of these consorts, a woman known as Equine, about whom virtually nothing is recorded. The evidential basis for even this assertion is exceedingly tenuous, as she is not identified as Athelstan's mother in any sources written prior to the Norman conquest of 1066. Consequently, the only evidence supporting Equine as Athelstan's mother dates from 2 centuries after his time of birth and may not be dependable. What is clear is that Athelstan had numerous siblings and half-siblings, resulting from his father's other relationships with at least 2 other consorts named Elfled and Edgifu. Athelstan was born during a period when Britain was entangled in conflict and transformation. Reflecting back to the Iron Age of the first millennium BC, Britain existed as a mosaic of dozens of Celtic tribes, known in this region as Britons, who controlled small territories. Much of the island had been unified under Roman rule from the mid-1st century AD onwards. Although the Caledonians of Scotland never submitted to Roman authority, Britain was one of the few areas of the empire to experience a strategic withdrawal when the Romans removed their legions from the country in 410 AD, seeking to prevent the complete collapse of the Western Roman Empire on the continent, as waves of Germanic and Asiatic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube rivers into Roman territory. Thereafter, Germanic groups, with the Angles and Saxons being the most numerous, had invaded Britain and carved out their own political entities. Over the course of the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, numerous such states rose to control large expanses of Britain, roughly corresponding with modern-day England. Notably Mercia in the 8th century, while Wessex emerged as a major power in southern England in the 9th century, expanding into the English Midlands at the expense of a declining Mercia. Although Athelstan's grandfather, Alfred the Great, is often labeled as the first king of England, in reality, a fully unified and secure English state would only materialize in the 10th century. Therefore, Athelstan was born into the royal lineage of Wessex, yet at a time when the rulers of Wessex were deliberately attempting to present themselves as having a legitimate claim to rule all of England. This situation had been greatly complicated in the 9th century by the arrival of what are often, somewhat inaccurately, referred to as the Vikings. The Norse people who commenced their expansion from Scandinavia towards the end of the 8th century were known by various names in different regions, notably being called the Rus in Eastern Europe and the Northmen or Normans in northern France. But in England, they were typically termed the Danes. As elsewhere, the Danes had initially been content to conduct raids against England, subsequently returning to Norway and Denmark with their plunder and captives. However, from the middle of the 9th century onwards, they had begun settling in and assuming control of large areas of northern and eastern England, establishing political entities such as the Kingdom of Northumbria and the Kingdom of East Anglia. The Danes are often depicted as having suffered a major defeat at Alfred's hands at the Battle of Edington in 878. Yet in reality, Athelstan's grandfather's victory over them there, a decade and a half before Athelstan's birth, had merely served to check the expansion of the Danes and prompted some of their leaders to convert to Christianity. These achievements notwithstanding, Edington certainly did not lead to the defeat of the Danes, and much of northern and eastern England remained under the control of powerful Danish rulers for decades to come, with significant implications for Athelstan's life and reign. Athelstan is regarded as one of the most important kings of Anglo-Saxon England, a period of English history spanning 6.5 centuries. His apparent significance to English political history towards the close of the early Middle Ages is not reflected in the volume of sources pertaining to his life. In stark contrast to the reign of a figure like his grandfather, Alfred the Great, there are very few detailed medieval accounts of Athelstan's life. William of Malmesbury's work is complemented by a diverse array of other source material that sheds light on Athelstan's time. The Durham Liber Vitae, a confraternity book dating from the 9th and 10th centuries, furnishes details of events in northern England during his era. The Mercian registers comprise a brief series of annals relating to the Mercia region of the English Midlands and the northwest of the country during Athelstan's father's reign. These invariably comment on Athelstan's subsequent time as king and the political backdrop of England in the first half of the 10th century. The Liber Eliensis, or Book of Ely, is a 12th century chronicle chronicling the history of the Ely region in Cambridgeshire between the 7th and 12th centuries, containing fragmented information on Athelstan. Furthermore, there is the tangible evidence that archaeologists have unearthed over the years in the material culture of coins, relics, and buildings from Athelstan's time that reside in museums and libraries today. Nevertheless, significant gaps in our knowledge concerning Athelstan persist, and, as we shall observe, the most crucial battle he fought, which has solidified his reputation as one of the country's foremost medieval monarchs, remains so enigmatic in many respects that historians are uncertain even of its location. Indeed, such is the discontinuous nature of the information available on Athelstan's life and time as king, that the first comprehensive biographical book about him was only published in 2011, a highly unusual circumstance for an English monarch, most of whom have been the subjects of dozens of books over the past century or so. Historians were simply reluctant until recent times to attempt to reconstruct Athelstan's life, given the paucity of available material from which to do so. It is from William of Malmesbury that we learn that Athelstan was favored from the time he was little more than an infant by his grandfather Alfred, who presented his young grandson with valuable gifts, including a cloak dyed in rich scarlet, along with a belt inlaid with precious gemstones. Alfred also bestowed an elaborate sword with a valuable scabbard upon his grandson, presumably before Athelstan even possessed the strength to raise it, as the child could not have been more than 4 or 5 years old at the time. Given Alfred's death in 899 when Athelstan was just 5 or 6 years old, Athelstan also owed his education to his grandfather. Alfred the Great was more than simply an effective military leader. He was also one of England's first scholar kings and had fostered a court populated by some of the era's most distinguished scholars. It was under some of these, many of them church figures who continued to inhabit the royal households of Alfred's sons and daughters after his own death, that Athelstan studied Latin and other subjects in the late 890s and into the 900s. Coins and royal portraits offer highly stylized depictions of Athelstan's appearance, though we learn from William of Malmesbury that he was slightly shorter than the average height of that time, thus not much above 5 feet, and possessed a slender build and fair brownish gold hair. Edward controlled a significant portion of southern England and the Midlands, but a much weakened Mercia still persisted as an Anglo-Saxon rival in the northwest, with the Danes holding the Kingdom of East Anglia north of London in eastern England, and the Kingdom of Northumbria dominating northern England. Worse still, new contingents of Danes were also establishing themselves at various points along the southern coast in the English Channel during the 900s and 910s. Edward responded effectively to these threats throughout his lengthy quarter-century reign. He succeeded in eliminating many of the Danish footholds in the south, while Mercia was largely subdued when Athelstan's aunt Ethelfled became Lady of the Mercians after her husband Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, fell gravely ill in 909. He died 2 years later. Thereafter, Mercia continued as a client state of Wessex until 918 when it was united with Wessex. Although this latter action did provoke some unrest among the nobility in Mercia in the late 910s, this subjugation of Mercia allowed Edward to campaign with considerable success against the Danes of East Anglia, and in 917 and 918 he conquered and annexed their kingdom. Athelstan served his apprenticeship as a military commander during these wars, campaigning in both East Anglia and Mercia in the 910s. While there is more than a suggestion in the sources, fragmentary as they are, that after his aunt Ethelfled died in 918, Athelstan governed Mercia on behalf of his father. By that time, he was in his mid-20s, a perfectly suitable age to undergo his political apprenticeship. By the early 920s, Wessex actually found itself in a far stronger position than it had been in Alfred's time, with southern England, London, and East Anglia, the Midlands, and the East Coast all under Edward's dominion. Only the kingdom of Northumbria in the north, under the Danish king Sigtryg, a ruler who had previously been king of Dublin and who possessed extensive connections and allies among the Norse of Ireland and the Scots, held out against Wessex's dominance over England. This was the political environment into which Athelstan would succeed as King of Wessex in 924. King Edward the Elder died on July 17 in the year 924, around his 50th year. Like Athelstan and so many other Anglo-Saxon rulers, his date of birth is unknown, preventing us from being certain of his age at the time of his death. It is by no means certain that Edward had intended for Athelstan to inherit all of his dominions. It was far more customary in the early Middle Ages for kingdoms and lordships to be divided among a ruler's sons upon his death. And indeed, the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne, which dominated Western and Central Europe in the early 9th century, had fragmented in the following century due to its division. It seems plausible that Edward had intended for Athelstan to succeed as ruler of Mercia, and that his half-brother, another of Edward's sons, Elfward, would inherit the Wessex dominions. If this was the favored arrangement, it never came to fruition, as Elfward conveniently died at Oxford 16 days after Edward under unclear circumstances. That there was perhaps some reluctance to accept Athelstan as ruler over the entirety of Edward's dominions is indicated by the fact that Athelstan's coronation was held in September 925, a full 14 months after his father's death. The delay may have stemmed from opposition to Athelstan stirred up by another of his half-brothers, Edwine, a full biological brother of Elfward, and a figure who appears to have commanded a base of support in Winchester, the capital of the Kingdom of Wessex. Athelstan eventually overcame the opposition, but Edwine would remain a rival in the years to come. The early years of Athelstan's reign witnessed his conquest of the last independent part of England, the Kingdom of Northumbria, through a combination of diplomacy and military activity. In 926, he met with King Sigtryg of Northumbria in the town of Tamworth and concluded a treaty with him whereby the Norse ruler would marry a sister or half-sister of Athelstan's, whose name is not recorded. The marital alliance was accompanied by an agreement concerning the respective borders of Athelstan's and Sigtryg's kingdoms. When Sigtryg died just a year later, Athelstan attempted to assert that the agreement at Tamworth had included a provision for him to succeed as ruler of Northumbria upon Sigtryg's death. He faced a challenger, however, when Guthfrith, a Norse ruler who had earlier succeeded Sigtryg as King of Dublin across the Irish Sea, and who was most likely a brother of Sigtryg's, put forward his own claims to Northumbria. Military clashes followed in northern England, in which Athelstan emerged victorious after what appears to have been a relatively minor campaign. Guthfrith would continue to pose a threat from across the Irish Sea, as would his son Olaf Guthfrithson after he succeeded him as King of Dublin in later years. In the short term, the victory in 927 and the incorporation of Northumbria into his territories made Athelstan the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to fully unify all of what is now England under his rule. In this sense, it was he, rather than his grandfather, Alfred the Great, or indeed his father, Edward the Elder, who should be considered the first true king of England. Although clearly Alfred and Edward had laid the groundwork for the Kingdom of Wessex to unite the country and had aspired to the kingship of all the Anglo-Saxons of England. Athelstan's rise to control northern England would not go unchallenged, and the northward expansion immediately gave rise to the border tensions that would define Anglo-Scottish relations for over 600 years thereafter. Although Athelstan held a gathering at Ament, just south of Penrith, in the summer of 927, during which he succeeded in obtaining acknowledgement of his position as the ruler of the territories held by the Angles and Saxons since the 5th and 6th centuries, the lands of the Angles, or England, from several Welsh lords and King Constantine II of Scotland. As soon as these other British lords and rulers had dispersed from Ament and returned home, they began plotting against the new King of England. It was some years before minor border tensions escalated into full-scale war. This occurred in 934 when Athelstan was prompted to invade Scotland and campaigned all the way north to the northeast, where a separate Norse kingdom governed the coastal regions and the Orkney Islands. He then turned back south after laying waste to the countryside, burning crops and sacking villages in a brutal scorched earth campaign. The conflict was not over, however, and a growing alliance was now forming between the Scots under Constantine and several Norse powers and the Danes, such as King Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, preparing to launch a combined assault on Northumbria and Athelstan's other territories. As these tensions were mounting along the northern border, there remained unresolved issues domestically in Wessex for Athelstan. His half-brother Edwine maintained his own base of supporters in Winchester and elsewhere in southern England, individuals who had seemingly resisted Athelstan's succession to all of Edward the Elder's dominions back in 924, eventually relenting the following year. Edwin had, however, remained troublesome, and that he commanded significant support appears evident from the fact that the influential Bishop of Winchester was excluded from Athelstan's government in the initial years of the reign. Although the scarcity of sources for the reign means we do not know what Edwine was doing in the years that followed, it is surely significant that in 933 he was compelled to leave Wessex due to what a set of French annals termed a, quote, disturbance in England. He boarded a ship to depart the country and subsequently died. Later sources claim he was shipwrecked at sea. However, it is now speculated that the cause of his death was deliberately misrepresented in later years, and that rather than perishing at sea in some kind of storm, Athelstan actually orchestrated his half-brother's killing. The timing suggests that Edwine had possibly become a focal point of discontent and plotting against Athelstan. Perhaps he had been in contact with Athelstan's enemies in Scotland or across the Irish Sea in Dublin, and the king decided to permanently eliminate a rival who had been a persistent nuisance for many years. It is impossible to know for certain. The threat that the growing alliance of the Scots and Norse lords of Scotland, the Orkneys, and the Irish Sea region posed to Athelstan and his newfound dominance of northern England reached a climax in 937, in what must undoubtedly rank as one of the most important but mysterious battles in English political history. Historians agree that the Battle of Brunanburh was every bit as significant as Alfred's victory at the Battle of Edington over half a century earlier in establishing a united England largely under Anglo-Saxon control. For instance, the Annals of Ulster, a lengthy compilation of Gaelic annals focusing on Ulster in Northern Ireland over a period of 100 years, though also documenting events across the Gaelic world, including Scotland, refer to Brunanburh as a, quote, great victory for Athelstan and a, quote, lamentable and horrible battle for Gaelic lords like King Constantine of Scotland. No archaeological site has ever been definitively identified as corresponding to the battle, though a plausible candidate is surely also the northwestern region of England, around Liverpool, north towards Blackpool, as one brief account of the battle notes that one of the Norse contingents that fought in the battle was able to make a hasty retreat back across the Irish Sea to Dublin in its aftermath. The location of Brunanburh may be disputed, but the outcome is not. Armies of unknown size confronted each other. Athelstan's Anglo-Saxon forces, which must have included a sizable contingent of Danes who were second and third generation settlers in places like East Anglia and willing to fight for an Anglo-Saxon king, faced a coalition of Scots and Norse soldiers led by King Constantine of Scotland, King Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and a number of more minor lords, which probably included King Owain of Strathclyde. These adversaries of Athelstan's held differing personal motives for resisting his expansionist policies, with Constantine and the other Scots anxious to prevent any further northern expansion and, if possible, to reclaim parts of Northumbria, while Olaf believed he held a claim to Northumbria by right of his relation to the deceased King Sigtryg. Whatever ambitions they might have harbored soon dissipated. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Athelstan achieved the greatest victory the Anglo-Saxons had ever secured on British soil in over 4 centuries since their initial arrival. The Norse of Dublin fled back across the Irish Sea, and their allies dispersed northwards, leaving Athelstan in undisputed control of Northumbria for the remainder of his reign. It was not solely in Northumbria that Athelstan expanded his dominions, or at least aspired to. His reign also marked a significant stride towards a King of England asserting a claim to Wales. The people of Britain today are accustomed to the island being politically divided into the distinct countries of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, albeit united politically as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But this configuration was not always the case. The Celtic Britons of pre-Roman Britain would have drawn no such distinction between England, Wales, and Scotland. Instead, the idea of a distinct Scotland emerged as this was the portion of the island the Romans never conquered, while it was also heavily Gaelicized by Gaelic Irish settlers from Northern Ireland in late antiquity and the early medieval period, in contrast to the lands further to the south. Wales's independent political identity came about largely because this part of southern Britain was not conquered by the Angles and Saxons in the 5th and 6th centuries, while some of the Anglo-Saxon lords of the early medieval era, notably King Offa of Mercia, began constructing earthwork defenses across the region, where the border between England and Wales lies today. The most renowned element of this is Offa's Dyke, erected in the 8th century, large stretches of which are still visible in the landscape along the border. The Cymry people here gradually began developing a distinct identity west of Offa's Dyke that would evolve into Welsh identity over time, complete with its own unique language. Despite these developments, the geographical proximity of Wales to England, with its very extensive border, made it somewhat inevitable that once an Anglo-Saxon ruler had united England in the manner Athelstan did by 927, he would attempt to impose his rule over Wales. Evidence of Athelstan's ambitions was apparent at the council he convened at Amon in 927 to have the other lords and monarchs of Britain acknowledge his control over Northumbria. Several Welsh lords, such as Hywel Dda of the West Welsh, were present at this gathering, and in Athelstan's view, this could have been perceived as more junior lords coming to acknowledge his overlordship over them. The fact that Athelstan subsequently took hostages in the form of younger sons and relatives of these Welsh lords to be raised at his court in England as a guarantee of their future obedience clearly indicates that they entered into these vassalage agreements unwillingly. Perhaps Athelstan had campaigned against the Welsh in the mid-920s, compelling them to acknowledge him as their overlord. And details of these military undertakings are simply not recorded in the handful of medieval chronicles that briefly cover Athelstan's reign. Regardless of the circumstances of how it came about, Athelstan's partial subjugation of the Welsh lords in the 920s and the manner in which he had campaigned militarily into Scotland in 934 fostered a growing conviction in him, not only as the king of a united England, but also in his capacity to exercise imperium, or imperial rule, over all of Britain. In accordance with this, he consciously sought to present his claim to be the ruler of a united Britain to the world as his reign progressed. In the mid-920s, shortly after he had become King of Wessex, Athelstan is still described in charters and other royal documents that have survived as the King of the Anglo-Saxons, the same title his grandfather Alfred and father Edward had generally employed on royal documents. Yet from 927 onwards, the titles he used on charters and other documents demonstrated his expanding claims to rule not merely England but all of Britain. Some employ the Latin term Rex Anglorum, meaning King of the English. Others go beyond this to utilize the phrase Rex Totius Britannia, King of all Britain. Although other documents were more equivocal, and Athelstan defined himself in these as King of England and Guardian of Britain, an ambiguous title that acknowledged his control only over England, but aspired to exercise a form of imperial rule over the entirety of Britain. This constitutes an immensely significant development. The kings of England for centuries to come, particularly so in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, would aspire to universal rule of Britain. There exists a direct link between Athelstan's actions in this regard and the reign of King Edward IV in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the English monarch who finally conquered Wales and nearly Scotland as well. There were other distinct new elements to the manner in which Athelstan governed. He expanded the convening of witans or councils. These had been utilized by various Anglo-Saxon monarchs since the 7th century, but they were being employed more systematically as a method of governance by Athelstan's time. The scale of the witans convened by Athelstan and the frequency with which they met have led some historians to propose that Athelstan was a crucial figure in the development of what might be considered an embryonic parliament in England. This likely goes too far. The probability is that Athelstan and his father Edward before him had simply expanded their dominions so significantly in the 910s and 920s, effectively incorporating Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria into their territories that it became necessary to convene ever larger witons and with greater frequency to hear the grievances of local lords and officials and mitigate the possibility of regional revolts and disturbances. If the expanded use of witons and royal councils by Athelstan was merely an expedient measure designed to ensure that the lords of his realms remained peaceful and compliant, there was nothing haphazard or half-hearted about the manner in which he sought to centralize power at his court in Winchester through the application of legal and administrative instruments. One of the most important aspects of this was through the increased utilization of royal charters. Royal charters had been in use throughout Anglo-Saxon history, but in contrast to the general paucity of histories and chronicles concerning Athelstan, there was a marked increase in the number of royal charters issued during his reign. Furthermore, studies of these documents have identified clear literary connections in terms of their composition, indicating that they must have been the work of a small group of anonymous scribes employed by Athelstan at Winchester over a period of years, suggesting the development of a growing chancery or a nascent civil service of sorts at the court there. Similarly, while coins had been issued by Athelstan's Anglo-Saxon forebears in Wessex, Mercia, and other parts of England for centuries, Athelstan demonstrated mastery in their deployment for political ends. It was from the coins utilized by English men and women for trade and commerce in the 930s that they could read the phrase Rex Totius Britannia, King of all of Britain, adjacent to the side profile depiction of Athelstan, communicating to the king's subjects his newfound aspiration to rule over all of Britain. Few individuals would have possessed sufficient literacy to comprehend the words themselves, yet their significance would have been conveyed by those who could. The charters being issued by Athelstan's administration indicate his engagement with a wide array of legal matters confronting England during a period of increasing governmental activity. For instance, the Ordinance of Dunsetae was promulgated to regulate legal jurisdictions along the border with Wales, while a broad range of laws pertaining to local issues for regions such as London and Kent were issued in Athelstan's name. While these developments suggest the emergence of a more centralized and potent state under Athelstan, the reality was that any early medieval kingdom possessed limited capacity to exert control over a large territory, stretching from Northumbria in the north to the English Channel in the south, and from Cornwall in the west to the Wash on the North Sea on the east coast. Consequently, Athelstan had to govern through a network of influential local lords known in Anglo-Saxon England as ealdormen, from which the modern municipal title of alderman derives. Some of these ealdormen could be immensely powerful figures who effectively administered their localities on the king's behalf. It would be premature to characterize Athelstan as presiding over a feudal lordship. That system would only fully materialize later through Norman culture. However, it is essential to acknowledge that Athelstan, as powerful and significant a monarch as he was, did not function as an autocratic king in the mold of a 17th or 18th century ruler of an absolutist monarchy like France or Russia. He consistently relied on close relationships with figures such as the ealdormen to maintain control over a kingdom as vast as the one he had consolidated by the 930s. Although unfortunately our knowledge of Athelstan's personal life and the subtleties of his character is quite limited, we do understand that he possessed a more cosmopolitan perspective than his predecessors. Athelstan stands as the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to formulate a foreign policy deliberately aimed at fostering connections between the royal house of England and some of the leading royal lineages and noble families of continental Europe. He achieved this by arranging a series of marriages between members of his extended family and other European rulers. For example, in 926, he received an embassy from France proposing a marriage alliance between Hugh of Neustria and Athelstan's half-sister Eadhild. The marriage alliance that was negotiated included the presentation of several holy relics to Athelstan, the accumulation of which was a personal passion of his. 4 years later, Eadgith, another half-sister of Athelstan's, was married to Otto, the future king of Germany. Thus, Athelstan pursued a deliberate policy designed to cultivate ties with the royal houses of France and Germany and prominent lords within those realms. It was not solely through marriage alliances that Athelstan's foreign policy was characterized. His court also evolved into a hub of intrigue for individuals with interests in the kingdom of the Franks and elsewhere. Back in 922, 2 years prior to Athelstan's succession to his father's throne, his half-sister Edgifu, who some years earlier had married Charles the Simple, King of the Franks, returned home to England with her and Charles's young son, Louis. The circumstances were that Charles had been removed from the throne in France, and his throne had been usurped by Robert, Count of Paris. Edgifu had returned home not only seeking assistance to support her husband's cause, but also that of her son Louis. Athelstan permitted Edgifu and Louis to remain in England after he became king, and his court became a regular gathering place for Frankish nobles who wished to support Charles the Simple's cause. That cause transitioned to Louis from 929 onwards when Charles died, and from that date Athelstan was effectively supporting his half-nephew's claim to the title of King of the Franks. Louis commanded many supporters, chief among them the Margrave of Neustria, Hugh the Great, who in 936 paved the way for Louis's return to France and his assertion of his father's throne. This marked the beginning of an alliance between the Frankish state and England, as Athelstan contributed to a fleet that King Louis dispatched to subdue some of his more unruly lords in the Flemish sections of the Low Countries in 939. Other visitors to Athelstan's court in the 930s from the continent included lords from northern France who were being displaced by the Norse settlers there, a harbinger of England's future issues with the Normans across the English Channel. Athelstan's foreign policy, particularly concerning the monarchies and states of continental Europe, centered on marriage alliances, and these entirely revolved around his half-siblings and their progeny. This was because Athelstan himself did not marry, nor is there any evidence that he engaged in sustained marriage negotiations at any point. He was clearly a deliberate bachelor. Most historians specializing in late Anglo-Saxon England concur that Athelstan's decision not to marry stemmed from his evident religious piety and a desire to maintain celibacy. The various chronicles and annals mention that he was unusually devout, and this explains his unmarried status. Athelstan's religious fervor was symptomatic of an era of increasing Christianity in England. This was part of a religious reform movement that had commenced under Athelstan's grandfather and continued into the 10th century, partly driven by a strand of thought known as millenarianism, which perceived that the approach of the year 1000, the millennium anniversary of Jesus' birth, might signal the second coming of Christ. Athelstan's religiosity led him to patronize numerous monastic abbeys and institutions. For instance, he founded new abbeys, with those at Milton Abbas in Dorset and Muchelney in Somerset being the most prominent. Other existing religious houses that benefited from his generosity included Malmesbury Abbey. Given that the principal chronicler of his reign, William of Malmesbury, was a monk here 2 centuries later, we must bear in mind that William might have been inclined to present an overly favorable account of Athelstan in his portrayal of the king and his achievements as a monarch who had patronized Malmesbury Abbey. More broadly, Athelstan stood at the center of the Benedictine reform movement of the 10th century, a movement that sought to revitalize the Benedictine order, which dominated monasticism in early medieval Europe, but was perceived as having become excessively worldly and materialistic by the 10th century. Athelstan and other monarchs of the time advocated for a return to a strict adherence to the 6th century rule of Saint Benedict, a guide that laid down clear regulations concerning monastic behavior and observances. One of the most peculiar aspects of Athelstan's reign and character, intimately connected to his religious piety, was his role as a collector of relics. His interest in acquiring objects associated with saints and even with Christ himself was so profound that it was recognized internationally. William of Malmesbury recounts a letter that he claims to have seen from the prior of an abbey in Brittany in northwestern France, written to Athelstan, in which he noted his awareness that relics were, quote, dearer to you than all earthly substances. This is corroborated by other sources that mention Athelstan hiring individuals whom he dispatched to travel across continental Europe in search of religious relics that could be acquired and brought back to England. Some of the figures involved were leading clerics, including the Bishop of Worcester, Senwald, who visited Germany on such missions. Among the most famous relics believed to have been acquired were the Holy Lance, or Spear of Destiny, the weapons said to have been used to pierce the side of Jesus crucified on the cross by a Roman soldier seeking to confirm his death, as well as the sword of Constantine, a blade believed to have fragments of the true cross embedded in its hilt. The authenticity of such relics is, of course, dubious. Numerous different versions of the Holy Lance circulated throughout Europe in medieval times, and there were enough pieces of the true cross to have formed a small forest. These 2 relics were allegedly deposited at Malmesbury Abbey, where they served as major attractions for religious tourists and pilgrims, while other churches and abbeys received equally curious relics acquired by Athelstan, including the purported arm and crozier of St. Samson, who was believed to have played a prominent role in Christianizing Brittany, Cornwall, and parts of Wales in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Following in the footsteps of his grandfather Alfred, Athelstan fostered the development of a learned court where scholarship held an important place. All of this aligned with the spirit of the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement encouraged by Emperor Charlemagne at his court in Aachen in western Germany in the 790s and 800s, when he had aimed to restore learning and the arts in a manner not seen since the decline of the Roman Empire. While England was not yet producing indigenous scholars of the caliber of William of Malmesbury, who in the 12th century was considered by some to be one of the most learned men in Christendom, Athelstan's court did become a haven for expatriates from Europe, who came to write and work at Winchester, evidently being offered generous terms by the English king to relocate. A polymath who engaged in poetry, philosophy, religious commentary, literature, and even authored a treatise on an obscure medieval board game called the Game of the Gospels. He was one of the few individuals at that time in Europe who was an accomplished Greek scholar and knowledgeable of the Greek religious philosophy known as Neoplatonism, a movement that had emerged in late antiquity and which in many ways influenced the early Christian church. Athelstan's patronage of a learned court and his activities as a relic collector extended to acquiring a library of valuable books and manuscripts, which he then donated to leading religious houses throughout England. Books were an enormously valuable commodity in early medieval England, particularly vellum copies of the Bible, which were ornately copied out. The provenance of some of these indicates they were acquired from religious houses in the Low Countries and other parts of the continent by Athelstan, often having been copied out over a period of years by skilled scribes. The latter part of Athelstan's reign, in the relative peace that followed the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, was spent largely dedicated to these religious and scholarly pursuits. He was particularly eager to ensure that England's monastic houses and abbeys were adhering to the religious reform trends being actively pursued on the continent, and Athelstan's relic hunters in Germany and elsewhere, such as Bishop Senwald, were also tasked with observing the reforms taking place in the Benedictine monasteries they visited and stayed at during their travels. Thus, Athelstan's religious program extended beyond the mere collection of relics of questionable authenticity or elaborately produced manuscript books to real, tangible changes in the organization and management of the Church in England in a manner that impacted the daily lives of his subjects. It served as a testament to the success of his construction of a unified kingdom, stretching from Northumbria to the English Channel, that Athelstan was able to devote his final years to endeavors other than warfare. It would, however, prove to be an all too brief period of peace for England. Athelstan died while in Gloucester, in the core of his Wessex dominions, on October 27, 939. He would have been in his mid-40s, hardly an advanced age, though sufficiently old by early medieval standards that his death may have been due to a fairly common illness. And there is no suggestion that his premature death resulted from any foul play. His burial deviated from the pattern that had been established for several centuries by rulers of Wessex and the West Saxons, in that he was not interred at Winchester. This was the old capital of Wessex and the royal center where most kings had been buried for several centuries and where the remains of many still rest in bone chests today, situated atop stone screens just above the main nave of the cathedral. Instead, Athelstan was laid to rest at Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire. He may have been seeking to break with the traditions of his ancestors, who had been rulers of Wessex, and establish a new tradition for the kings of a united England. William of Malmesbury provides an unusually detailed account of his burial, undoubtedly enthusiastic due to Athelstan's patronage of the abbey, where he himself was a monk 2 centuries later, describing how the many relics Athelstan had acquired during his reign were carried before his coffin as he was entombed at Malmesbury, while numerous funerary goods of gold and silver were interred with him. Athelstan's death left the succession question open. As he had aged and not married or had children, this had become increasingly pressing, and a general consensus had developed around a favored candidate, despite the presence of many half-siblings, nephews, and cousins who were potential claimants. The figure chosen from among these was Athelstan's half-brother, Edmund, born to Edward the Elder and his younger consort, Edgifu. Born around 920, Edmund was old enough by 939 to assume the throne uncontested. The change of monarchs presented an opportunity for Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, who, despite the setback at Brunanburh 2 years earlier, retained ambitions to claim control of Northumbria, and crossed to northern England to assert control over the region when news of Athelstan's death reached him. Hence, despite Athelstan's best efforts, Northumbria quickly fell out of Anglo-Saxon control following his death and would only be gradually reclaimed in the 940s. The events immediately subsequent to Athelstan's death highlight the fluctuating nature of England's politics over the ensuing century. A strong ruler like Athelstan could unify England under his dominion, but once strong, centralized Anglo-Saxon kingship waned. There were always Scottish, Welsh, and Norse or Danish elements ready to exploit the situation. Such was the case in the mid-950s when the kingdom was divided between Edmund's sons, Edwig and Edgar. Decades of internal strife in the latter half of the 10th century allowed for a resurgence of the Danes in England, and by the early 11th century, new contenders had emerged to rule England, some originating directly from either Denmark or Norway. Indeed, such was the ongoing nature of Danish influence over Britain that in 1016, a young Danish warlord named Canute or Canute was able to establish himself as King of England. He subsequently succeeded to the thrones of Denmark and Norway in 1018 and 1028, making England just one component of a composite North Sea empire. All of this underscores the fact that while Athelstan succeeded in uniting England for a time under Anglo-Saxon rule, the threat posed by the Danes and other Norse groups never entirely subsided until the Norman conquest of England from 1066 onwards introduced a unifying power to the country. When they did arrive, they were also largely Norse. The Normans may have come to England from northern France, but they were ultimately descendants of Vikings who had settled along the lower reaches of the River Seine in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, roughly around the time that Athelstan was growing up and preparing to succeed his father. It is undeniable that King Athelstan stands as one of the most important early rulers of England. Alongside his grandfather, Alfred the Great, and his father, Edward the Elder, he was instrumental in the critical process between the mid-9th and mid-10th centuries, whereby the Kingdom of Wessex in southern England united modern-day England under Anglo-Saxon rule by conquering Mercia, the Kingdom of East Anglia, and the Kingdom of Northumbria. He achieved this largely by 927 and subsequently confirmed his control of northern England through victory in the decisive Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a reign-defining military engagement about which we possess surprisingly few details. And he was not vital solely in terms of unifying England and having a claim to being the first true king of England. He also immediately upon uniting England laid down the claims to universal rule over Britain that the kings of England would pursue for centuries to come, seeking to overawe the Welsh lords in a manner that foreshadowed the English conquest of Wales in the High Middle Ages and asserting a British imperium over Scotland. Further afield, he initiated the process whereby England entered into marriage alliances and dynastic relationships that would create entanglements between England and countries like France in centuries to come, while domestically he established the foundations for England's development into the most centralized and effectively administered kingdom in Western Europe by the 12th and 13th centuries. In summary, while we are frustratingly limited by a lack of detailed sources for Athelstan's life and reign, there is no denying from what we do know about him that Athelstan was one of the most important Anglo-Saxon monarchs in England prior to the Norman conquest. What is your opinion of Athelstan? Do you believe he is one of England's underappreciated kings solely due to the scarcity of surviving sources, or because of a lack of significant accomplishments as monarch? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.